out there, at one point or another, was the Antichrist in these conversations. My favorite conspiracy theory out of all of them, did you know Ronald Wilson Reagan? 6 letters in Ronald, 6 letters in Wilson, 6 letters in Reagan. Bum, bum, bum. Then after Reagan was the Antichrist, Clinton was the Antichrist because Republicans. And then Bush was the Antichrist because Democrats. And then Obama was the Antichrist because racist Republicans. And now people are going to say, well, maybe Trump's the Antichrist. There's even a theory right now that there's a guy named Erdogan in Turkey, and he's the Antichrist. That every single time we look for somebody who's going to be the big bad guy. And then we put our story into that. And so I've heard the book of Revelation told as a story about the Cold War between Russia and the United States. I've heard it as a story talked about in the post-9/11 world where all of this craziness is happening in the Middle East, and we're trying to understand it all, and we're trying to make sense of it, and so we go to this book. And in this book, we see all of this vivid imagery, and the temptation is to write whatever we want to on top of it, to make it primarily about us, to make it a story that makes sense to us because we want it to. We're trying to make sense of our world. And so out of our fear, out of our paranoia, out of our desperation, we turn this story into this conspiracy document. And it was never that in the first place. We'll go to the next slide, I think. Yes, this is the book of Revelation, chapter 4. We're going to get into some other stuff in a second, but this is really the start of the main body of the book of Revelation. The first 3 chapters are letters to the 7 churches. There's some really good, really important stuff in there. The way that they were written, and this is just my nerd nugget to you. There's an order to how these letters are written. The 7 letters to the 7 churches. And the order is actually really simple. There was a big loop road that connected them all, and it's literally just one stop after another on the road. That's it. No big secret hidden meaning, just literally that's the next stop on the road. After those letters, we get the very first part of this gigantic vision that John receives. It says, after this I looked, and there in heaven a door stood open. And the first voice, which I had heard speaking to me like a trumpet, said, come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this. At once I was in the Spirit, and there in heaven stood a throne with one seated on the throne. And the one seated there looks like jasper and carnelian, and all around the throne is a rainbow that looks like an emerald. And around the throne are 24 thrones. And seated on the thrones are 24 elders, dressed in white robes with golden crowns on their heads. Coming from the throne are flashes of lightning and rumblings and peals of thunder. And in front of the throne burn 7 flaming torches, which are the 7 spirits of God. And in the front of the throne there is something like a sea of glass, like crystal. Around the throne and on each side of the throne are 4 living creatures full of eyes in front and behind. The first living creature like a lion, the second living creature like an ox, the third living creature with a face like a human face, and the 4th living creature like a flying eagle. And the 4 living creatures, each of them with 6 wings, are full of eyes around and inside. Day and night without ceasing they sing, holy, 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 the Lord God the Almighty, who was and is to come. And whenever the living creatures give glory and honor and thanks to the one who is seated on the throne, who lives forever, the 24 elders fell before the throne, or before the one who is seated on the throne, and worship the one who lives forever and ever. They cast their crowns before the throne, singing, "You are worthy, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power. For you created all things, and by your will they existed and were created." It's the word of the Lord. Now, let's go to the next slide. I think I did this right. Yes. This story, this is the very start of this story, and you get taken up to heaven, which happened all the time in books like this. Has anybody ever read a book in the same genre as the book of Revelation? Now, Daniel, parts of Isaiah, parts of Ezekiel. And there's a reason for that. Daniel, parts of Isaiah, and parts of Ezekiel are found all throughout John's Revelation. All throughout. All of the imagery that John the Revelator is using is borrowed. It is in his imagination already as a way for him to understand what is really going on because he knows his Old Testament. In addition, this is fun. There was a bunch of apocalyptic literature. A ton. None of the other stuff made it into our Bible. But in between the last book of the Old Testament, Malachi, which all of the cheesy pastors will make the joke here, so I'm going to follow in their stead, say that Malachi was the one Italian prophet because his name is Malachi. I know, it's the worst joke. It really is the worst joke. After Malachi, before Matthew, there's this time period. Sometimes it's called the silent period, but that isn't fair to all the stuff that's happening during that time. It's called the intertestamental period. During this time, there's a ton of stuff that's happening. It's about 300 years, and in that 300 years, there were all of these writings that were taking place. Most of it did not make it into even the Catholic canon, what we call the Apocrypha. None of it made it into the Protestant canon, into the 66 books that we have. But there was a bunch of stuff that was happening. And there were common themes to these stories. One, it's a revealing. An apocalypse means a revelation, that you get knowledge, that you get to see things that you wouldn't have been able to see before. That there are visions and vivid dreams that will happen in it. In most of these stories, there's also this narrator who's usually an angel that will be in the story itself to help the person who is experiencing these visions and dreams to interpret them. In addition, they get to go to a vantage point, either a high mountain or they get to go up to heaven. And the reason why they do this is not because the high mountain or heaven is cool, but so that they can see the world as it really is. They get the bird's eye view, they get the God's eye view, and then from there, they can see the world as the world really is. Wild visions are completely the norm in all of these stories. It is absolutely normal to have craziness go down in apocalyptic literature. The stories are given to encourage people to remain faithful. And they aren't necessarily about the future or the end of the world. One of the stories that happens here in Revelation 4 and 5 harkens back to one of the apocalyptic literature things called 4 Ezra. Part of the reason this stuff didn't make it into the Bible is because they were written well after the death of the people who claimed to write the book. So this is one of those times. And the stories were really common throughout. This is the thing that helps us to understand how this works. If you want to know what a murder mystery is like, what do? You go read murder mysteries, a lot of them. If you want to know what good fantasy stories are like, you go read Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. This is what we do. If you want to know what the classics are like, you go read Bronte. You go read like the old school stuff. Here, if you want to know what the revelation of John is like, you read other apocalyptic literature. In these stories, they often interpret other pieces of the Old Testament and rework them to help us understand. So these visions that they get somehow feel old and new at the same time. Here in Revelation 4, we see glimpses and images of the Old Testament bleeding into the New. Ezekiel chapter 1 is all over Revelation 4. The 4 living creatures that are described with the lion, the ox, the one with the human face, the flying eagle, that's pulled directly out of Ezekiel 1. And these stories are done in a way to help you understand the one who was, the one who is, the one who is to come. In addition, there is a current need in the story, as the first people read it, to help them understand what's really going on. And so it was about the past bleeding into the future and affecting the present. So, go to the next slide. The king who sits on the throne. I was looking for the best possible picture that would help us to understand what is happening in this story. This is a Persian king from a few hundred years later than the story that we're telling. But I found this picture to be helpful because his throne sounds an awful lot like the throne that's described in Revelation chapter 4. Give me some descriptions of this throne. What does it look like to you guys? Imperialistic? Okay, what do you mean by that?
Well, there's a lot of jewels, there's a lot of gold, and so he's showing his wealth.
It's very, very flashy. Jewels and gold. What does the chair look like to you guys? Describe it. The most basics about it.
Small.
Okay. Well, we've gotten bigger over time. The chairs haven't.
It's elevated.
It's elevated. Okay. Does this chair look macho to you?
No. Byzantine. It's a Byzantine.
Yeah. It doesn't look macho. It doesn't look comfortable. But it looks kind of effeminate in some ways.
Well, because it's going this way.
Yeah. Now, this chair is gaudy, it's flashy, it is showing wealth, and the Romans who saw it would have hated it. Let's go to the next slide. This is a Roman throne. What does this look like to you guys? What? Like a crib? Okay, you sit on it. You don't put a baby in it. Like a camp chair. Yeah. So comparing one to the other, the throne that was this Persian, Eastern, jewels and gold and gaudiness, and then this thing. What do you think this says about Romans? We're men. Okay, power's not in the seat. You want to hear something fun? The Romans saw a chair with a back as a sign of weakness. That your back wasn't strong enough to hold itself up. So when they sat, they would sit on a chair with no back, and they would sit with power. That was the way that men sit. Macho culture was deeply ingrained in Roman life. They were a violent, warlike people. And when they saw that imagery in Revelation 4, they would think, oh, God sounds a little effeminate. God sounds a little weak. And their imagery of what it meant to be macho would contrast with how they saw this story play out. Because what's a macho man? Tell me some things about macho men. They're tough. What do you mean by tough? The what? I didn't hear it.
I said it's full of themselves.
Full of themselves.
Always right. Always right.
They're right.
No, they're protectors and courageous.
Protectors. They're courageous. They can take a beating and give a beating. That if you punch them, they might look at you like you made them mad before they punch the living daylights out of you. Macho.
They're their own rule followers. The
Ooh.
rules they make up, they follow.
Okay, maybe. Not always, but maybe. That they have power and they have authority by their right hand. Their sword arm is what gives them authority. That was the image of what it meant to be powerful in that time. But that's not the image that is used to describe the Lord of hosts, the one who is and is to come. His power often looks like weakness to those around him, because it's not built just on his right hand, it is built on his sacrifice. I'm going to say this multiple times, but I'm going to say it now. The thing that I've discovered as I read through the book of Revelation is that the Jesus we find in Revelation is the same Jesus as we find in the Gospels. And that when we try to turn Jesus into something that he's not, everything gets pear-shaped. Let's go to the next slide. One more. Okay. Revelation 5. So after we see this one who was and is to come, this one who is the Lord and God, which, by the way, was a term that was used for the Roman emperor, we have this story. Then I saw in the right hand of the one seated on the throne a scroll written on the inside and on the back, sealed with 7 seals, and a mighty angel proclaiming with a loud voice, "Who is worthy to open the scroll and break its seals?" And no one in heaven or on earth or under the earth was able to open the scroll or to look into it. And I began to weep bitterly, because no one was found worthy to open the scroll or to look into it. Then one of the elders said to me, "Do not weep. See, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has conquered, so that he can open the scroll and its 7 seals." Then I saw, between the throne and the 4 living creatures and among the elders, a lamb standing as if it had been slaughtered, having 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth. And he went and took the scroll from the right hand of the one who was seated on the throne. And when he had taken the scroll, the 4 living creatures, the 24 elders, fell down before the Lamb, each holding a harp and golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. They sing a new song. "You are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals, for you were slaughtered, and by your blood you ransomed for God saints from every tribe and language and people and nation, and you have made them to be a kingdom and priests serving our God, and they will reign on the earth." Then I looked, and I heard the voice of many angels surrounding the throne and the living creatures and the elders. They numbered myriads and thousands of thousands, singing with full voice, "Worthy is the Lamb that was slaughtered to receive power and wealth and wisdom and might and honor and glory and blessing." Then I heard every creature in heaven and on earth and under the earth and in the sea and all that is in them, singing to the one who is seated on the throne and to the Lamb, be blessing and honor and glory and might forever and ever. And the 4 living creatures said, "Amen." And the elders fell down and worshiped. There's this story in this apocalyptic literature called Fort Ezra that helps us to understand what is happening here. It's based off of Daniel chapter 7, which, by the way, you should probably read Daniel 7 and parts of Isaiah as we go through this. Isaiah 60 is going to be really important too. But in Daniel 7, there are these 4 beasts. And one is a lion, and one is a bear, and one is this monster, this 4th one. It has wings and talons, but it doesn't say exactly what kind of animal it is. And we were actually able to understand some of what is going on here because we were able to see which one was which for a while. One was the Babylonians, one was the Greeks, and nobody knew what this 4th monster was. So in Fort Ezra, which is one of these apocalyptic literature things, it says this beast, this 4th beast in Daniel 7, was really an eagle, which symbolized Rome. The eagle is they had this thing that would be on the top of all of their flags, of all of their banners that they would carry out into battle. And it's this really common eagle that we see because it ended up on top of our flag. It's the one where it's got its wings out and its head's facing one direction. That eagle was a sign of the Roman Empire back in the day. And in Fort Ezra, chapter 11, if you want to go look it up, it's online. There is this lion who comes out and speaks to the eagle and says, yes, you have conquered the world, but you have not done it with truth. Therefore, your end will be assured. And in this story, he turns and looks for the lion. The one who was the Messiah who was to come, who was going to finally tell off those Romans, and looks, and instead he sees a slaughtered lamb. Standing and slain. And the sacrifice of the lamb is the thing that defines its worthiness. The fact that the lamb had suffered and bled and died was the thing that allows us to understand that the lamb is worthy of honor and glory and wisdom and power and blessing and strength. He is the one seated on the throne. This story in the book of Revelation, we think it was written about somewhere between 30 and 40 years after this big wave of persecution that happened under Nero. It was written late enough so that the stories of persecution could get kind of codified into legend, where these stories had kind of grown in their telling. And the tricky part was that they were in the middle of a good time. That things were kind of good for them right now. And the persecution that was going to come soon, and it happened a little while ago, wasn't happening right then and there. And the temptation was to think that maybe the empire is not the empire. Maybe if we just get along, that we can accomplish a little bit more. That maybe if we don't resist this evil thing that is here, life will be a little bit better for us. So one of the things that happens in this story is that we are reminded that the beast is still the beast, that the empire is still the empire, and that the way that the church conquers is not by fighting back or by giving in, but by mimicking the Lamb. There's going to be a tension that exists in this story, where the people of God are crying out for vengeance, and God responds by saying, not yet. It's going to be a little longer, because there's more that will suffer, and there's more that will die on my behalf. But in the midst of all of this, God is doing something new. God is creating a new heaven and a new earth, that as the old one collapses, the new one comes down out of heaven onto the earth. And God creates a beautiful new thing. Now, this is a story that for me kind of stinks. Because I kind of get the Roman aesthetic. Like, I don't want to be flashy. I don't want to be, gaudy. Like, I don't want any of that. But I also kind of don't want to look weak. Like, I like that Roman, a real man sits like this stuff. It appeals to this lizard part of my brain, where if you stand up straight and you have a good handshake and you don't take crap from anybody, that you're a real man. Real men build stuff. Real men do stuff. The one true Scotsman fallacy, but still, it's in my head as this thing of what a real man looks like. And God doesn't look like my vision of a real man. Because my vision of a real man kind of stinks. It's so limited and it's so limiting. My vision of what a real man looks like doesn't believe in people nearly as much as God does. My vision of what it looks like to be that person is so much dependent on my own strength. And this vision for us, this one who was and is to come, is the Lamb that was slaughtered. And that is how the Lamb conquers. Like, that's the crazy thing. The Lamb conquers by his blood. Go to the next slide. And the Jesus in Revelation 5 defines the rest of the book. The Lamb is the one who conquers by his own blood. And we've been looking for violence and for chaos in this story for so long that sometimes we miss the God who is working in the midst of violence and chaos that God did not cause to bring about a new creation. That what God is doing is going to be absolutely spectacular and new and beautiful and maybe even more gracious and more generous than we would expect. Okay, so we have a couple of minutes, and by the looks on your faces, you have questions. So let's talk. What is the distance here between the way that you've heard this story being told before and the way you hear it's being told right now?
As far as the east is from the west.
Okay. Why do you think that is? Because I'm young and a hippie? Maybe. I think in a lot of ways it has to do with our desire for violence, our desire to get revenge. That, oh good, we have this story where revenge is gotten on our behalf. You want to hear something crazy? In the entire book of Revelation, at no point does the church ever pick up the sword. Ever. They suffer. And their numbers are counted as holy and precious to God. But they never, ever, ever pick up the sword even to defend themselves. All right, I think I saw Vanessa raise your hand. Nick did. Hey, Nick.
Okay, it sounds like then, because I think the way that Revelation was talked about a lot is it's like a prediction of the future, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it sounds like this is like, it serves an entirely different purpose as an allegory that's supposed to tell us what we're supposed to do as Christians or as the body of Christ.
Yeah, and I'll be careful with allegory language, because allegories have special rules. But yeah, in a lot of ways, John's revelation might tell us the future, but that was never the point. Is everybody okay? Do you have to breathe that in for half a second?
I have a question.
Yes, Emery.
How do you know it was never the point?
All right. Okay. So the question that Emery asked is, how do you know that that the point of the book of Revelation was not to tell the future of this is how the world will end? Because it was written for people who lived 1900 years ago. And it was useful to them for their worship and for their edification, and so they could live holy lives. And that was why it was given, to help these people who lived 100 years after Jesus to stay faithful in the midst of tough times. And that is also the reason why it helps us today, to help us stay faithful in the middle of tough times. And the story that is being told, there's a chance that this story will tell the end of the world. I'm not going to pull that away and say it's not that, because I can't do that. But what I can say is that it was given to the people that needed it the most, to help them through a wave of persecution that was coming, to help reorient their imaginations so that they could see the God who was going to make all things new. Does that help?
Well, let me just say this.
Yeah.
I'm the person who, when I was in English studying poetry, and they said, this means this, this means this, this means this, I was the person that said, what if the poem just meant what the poem says? And so that's why what if the book just means what the book says? Because we're coming along afterwards, and we're saying, this is what it meant. And I like that. I really like what you're saying, and all the information you're bringing in, and all the history. And now I see how we look at it through our prism and our experiences and our culture and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But I still go back to, how do we know what God was thinking when he put this in John's head and what he wrote down?
Okay.
We just have to take all the other information that we have alongside of it, but we don't know for sure.
One of the things that helps us as we read through this big, crazy thing, almost every single image that's in here is borrowed. In Revelation 4, the four creatures, the lion, the ox, the one with the face, the one with the eagle, that's pulled directly from Ezekiel 1. That there are later points in time where John the Revelator is literally quoting Isaiah, where he says, I saw a new heaven and a new earth. When he says God will wipe away every tear from their eye. He didn't invent that. He's quoting Isaiah. When he talks about all of these creatures and the ones who cry out, holy, 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 the Lord, the God Almighty, that's Isaiah 6. When he's doing all of this, he's doing this in a way that, I'll use a metaphor that will help some of our younger folks. It's like he's writing fan fiction. It's like he's taking a story. I have two nephews named Sam and Dean, which is from this TV show called Supernatural. And by the way, they got the order switched. They had Sam first. But if you read a Supernatural fan fiction, a lot of what you read would be dependent on the original work, because that is how the imagination has a tendency to work. And John the Revelator's imagination is full of these Old Testament images that he's using to explain what is really happening. There's also an element in this of trying to avoid the censor, of saying things in a certain kind of way so that those who have ears to hear can hear it, and those who don't understand all of this other subtext, all of this other back imagery, the back catalog of the Old Testament prophets, that if you don't get that, you just think, oh, that's weird, and then you move on. All right, Nick, and then somebody who's not Nick and Anne Marie.
So, I just think what we do with the Bible is we read it and we come to understand things from it. We learn from it.
Yeah.
So even if this is a prediction of the future, we have to look at it from a perspective of trying to understand something from it, and it makes much more sense to understand the true nature of Jesus from this writing, instead of what we understand being, oh, there's going to be a evil Antichrist somewhere out there, we gotta go find that guy.
Yeah, the Antichrist Easter egg hunt is a gigantic waste of time.
It never says to do that.
Ever. And we're going to get into this later because it's just crazy weirdness. There's one time when the word Antichrist is used in the Bible. It's in 1 John, and it's used to talk about people who do not believe that Jesus is God. It's the only time the term is used. We've used it to describe this thing that we believe exists in the story, but it doesn't quite exist the way that we think it does. But that is for later. That is not for today.
Okay, so you said that you see Jesus in Revelation, that you see Jesus in the other parts of the Bible, right?
Yes.
And so isn't this pulling the whole concept of who God is in one final story? I mean, he's true here, and so he's true in Revelations. Nothing's changed. He's just saying, this is who I am.
Yes. And.
No?
No, yes. Yes to that. That Jesus is the same Jesus that we see in Matthew and Galatians and Revelation. And Jesus helps us to understand what God the Father is really like. And so when we see Jesus as the slaughtered lamb, as the one who conquers through his blood, through his suffering, that is the definitive picture of who God the Father is. So when we see these stories, we have to work through that lens to understand them. Because when we start to make them a little bit twisted, we distort the character of God. God kind of turns into this violent one who just slaughters tons and tons and tons of people. Yeah, Robert.
I was thinking this is actually quite refreshing because pale horses, seals, creatures and beasts with eyes.
Yeah.
I think that the book of Revelation was always ooh. And so, what you're saying when we twist things, I think that man used it to also put fear to bring people under subjection. And if it always seems fear, you see fear, you can't see through the lens because it's fear.
Right.
It seems scary. So I don't think that you can get a clear understanding of what you're saying actually, to me, makes sense.
Now, here's the fun part about what Robert just said. Fear has been the predominant theme that I've seen coming out of this book when I've heard it preached. Yeah? What is fear designed to do?
Get your attention.
Get your attention and control you. One of the big things that happened when I was in high school is we had this, there was a color code for terror. You guys remember that? That you kind of look, it's like how you see the fire danger in forests today. Well, today's a red day. Well, I guess I'd better not start a campfire. It was kind of the same way, but with terrorist attacks. And nobody really knew what the different colors meant. Like, it never really got below like orange or yellow either way. It was always be scared. We just didn't know if it's like be scared and move into a bunker, be scared, or be scared and go buy some ice cream to make you feel better scared. And that was kind of the world that you lived in. Buying stuff became the way to make us feel a little bit less scared. And so we lived in this world built on fear. And stories like this have been used to make people afraid, so they stay in line. And it was never the point. Yeah?
You were saying that when Christ was beaten, and we are seeing God with all those hurts and all those things, but yet when he was on the cross, God couldn't look at him.
Now, Jesus is God. Yes?
Yes.
So when Jesus was on the cross, so was God. And the Father turned his face away. Because in that moment, there was this ultimate disconnect between God and the world, between who God was and how he had to stand in the place of the world. And it wasn't that at that moment God hated his son. In that moment, God was there in the worst possible time, in the worst possible place, because Jesus was bearing the sin of the world. And yes, God the Father had to look away out of pain because he was there. Because Jesus himself was standing in the gap for all of us. Because Jesus himself suffered and bled and died on our behalf. And so in that moment, Jesus took what should have been our place. And it was never that God had self-hatred or hatred of his own son. It was that in that moment, God was taking the sin of everyone who had ever sinned, everyone who is currently sinning, and everyone who ever will sin on his body. And he was carrying that weight for us. So it wasn't that God was abandoning his own son. It was the only thing that could happen in that time and in that place. It was the natural outcome of all that had come before, and the only way that God could let evil exhaust itself upon him. And after that, evil lost its power. Because the suffering Lamb had conquered. Now, we are going to do something because we have only a couple minutes left. We talk about the one who is worthy. We talk about the one who has suffered and bled and died on our behalf. And we remember that through this ritual that we call communion. It is a very simple thing. There's a little bit of grape juice and there's a little bit of gluten-free bread. We do gluten-free bread because some of us have some gluten allergies, and we want this to be available to the whole church, to anyone who wants it. And so we took away a little barrier. The bread doesn't taste as good, but that is a small price to pay. And in doing this, we remember the death of Jesus, who was poured out for us. Said, "This is my body, which was broken for you." And this blood is the new covenant, that as often as you eat and often as you drink this, you proclaim the Lord's death until his return. So today I want us to remember that Christ has conquered death and evil, that Christ has sacrificed himself for us, that Christ has made a way when we thought there was none, and that he is the one who is worthy. So if you want, come and partake. We don't have any litmus test for who can or who cannot receive communion. You are welcome and invited to come. And it's very simple. You take it, you dip the bread in the cup, you eat it, and you just a quick prayer saying thank you. So I'm going to pray. And just line up along the sides. It won't take us very long. and we can do this together. Lord, you are the only one who is worth it. The only one who deserves everything that we can give you. Because you suffered and you bled for us when you absolutely did not have to. That you came here and loved us so much that you died on our behalf. That your love is stronger than the violence and the scariness and the sin that has existed here for so long, that exists in our hearts. So, Lord, we ask, help us to remember you well. That as we partake, as we eat and drink your body and your blood poured out for us, that you remind us how much you love us. Lord, remind us of your love. Remind us of who you are. We ask all of this in your name. Amen.